thank you all very much for coming here this evening. I'm going to talk to you about Tudor, the family story. Now, this is a biography of the dynasty, which begins with the fabulous Owen Tudor in the 15th century and goes right up to the death of Elizabeth. But that's rather too much for us to cover this evening. And so I thought we would focus on the lives of these sisters who would be Queen, Mary, Catherine, and Lady Jane Grey. And the reason I chose them today was that my work on the Grey sisters has inspired a brand new novel by Philippa Gregory, which came out in August, called The Last Tudor, which is about what happens after the last Tudor, Elizabeth I, dies. And I thought some of you might be interested in knowing the true history behind the fiction. Right, well, we hear a lot these days about fake news, but our generation didn't invent it. Fake news is as old as history, and what follows fake news is fake history. And the story of the Tudors is full of both, and not least the story of these three sisters. Many of us, I think, have long believed that Mary, Queen of Scots, the Stuart Queen, was the heir to Elizabeth I and was her great rival. But in fact, under the terms of Henry VIII's will and English statute, when Elizabeth was queen, her rivals and heirs were in fact these two Protestant princesses, Mary and Catherine Grey. They have almost been written out of history since, and their stories are really very romantic and remarkable. More of you may have heard of the elder sister, Lady Jane Grey, who's remembered as the 9 Days Queen. She was our first ruling queen, but with fake history, she has been reduced really to the status of a mere victim, an abused child. In this painting here by the French artist, 19th century artist Paul Delaroche, she is a kind of virgin sacrifice, a sort of eroticized image of female helplessness. And in fact, I came across a rather surprising letter written by the novelist Nancy Mitford to Evelyn Waugh, in which she said that all her adolescent sexual fantasies were inspired by this picture. As we're in a priory, however, I think we'll move rapidly on from that. So who was the real Jane Grey? Well, she was going to become queen when Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII, died. Edward was only 15 when he realized he was dying, possibly of tuberculosis. Under the terms of his father's will and in English law, his heir was his half-sister, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Following her was another half-sister, Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Now, Henry VIII had had his marriages to their mothers annulled, and both the sisters had been declared illegitimate. Edward, who was a Protestant, did not want to leave his throne to his Catholic sister, so he now wrote his own will, and he excluded Mary from the succession on the grounds of her illegitimacy. Since Elizabeth was illegitimate, she was also passed over, and he left the throne instead directly to his cousin, his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. And she was indeed the long-stop heir under the terms of Henry VIII's will. So what was Jane like? Well, I think what's important is to look at what was actually said about her at the time and what had been written about her at the time, and not what was written about her 100 years later, 50 years later, even as it would turn out 2 weeks after Edward died, because things would change and the stories would start to shift. What we know about Jane at this time is that she was highly intelligent and highly educated. She had a very ambitious father, Harry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and he hoped very much that she was going to one day marry Edward and that she would therefore have been a queen consort. She was therefore expected really to be an example. A queen would set an example to the people of England, and particularly a religious example. And so Jane was already really becoming something of a Protestant leader. Leading Protestant clerics were seeking her out as a patron, and elite women were writing her what were essentially fan letters. So on July the 6th, 1553, Edward died, and Jane was informed she was queen. Now, what would she have made of this? It may have been a bit of a surprise, because this hadn't been expected for the past 10 years when Mary had been Henry VIII's heir. But she accepted it, and she may even have been glad of it, because this was not an ecumenical age, and Lady Jane Grey was certainly not very ecumenically minded. She described Catholics as imps of the devil. Their souls were the stinking kennels of Satan. This being the case, I think it's fair to assume that she would have thought that God, and only God could make a legitimate ruler, would have preferred her over Mary, who had a soul that was essentially the stinking kennel of Satan. Mary, of course, took a different view. Now, Mary I, Mary Tudor, has been another victim of fake history, partly because she was on the losing side in the end of the Reformation struggle. She's been depicted as sort of weak and silly or just mad. Often in film, she seems to be quite bonkers. In reality, Mary Tudor was every inch a daughter of Henry VIII. She was a gambler. She was prepared to gamble, and she was now about to gamble with her life. She was ruthless, and she was also capable of being a populist, as we will see. Anyway, no one expected that Mary would now stand up for herself. She was viewed as a mere woman, merely a woman. That's what they said. The political nation was all behind Jane. The leading figures of the nation backed Jane. Members of the Privy Council had all signed up to Edward's will. They thought that she'd just slink off somewhere and sort of cry in a corner. But Mary didn't do that. Instead, on the first day that Jane was proclaimed queen publicly in London, July the 10th, 1553, she had a letter delivered to the Privy Council at the Tower. And in this letter, she said, "I am the rightful queen under the terms of Henry VIII's will and in English law, and you are essentially committing treason." She said to them that it was all obviously an embarrassing mistake on their part, and if they now came to their senses, she would just forgive and forget and move on. Now, clearly they couldn't really do that, but they were very shocked, because they now realized that rather than a smooth transition of power, there was going to be bloodshed. And some of the least certain amongst them began to get cold feet. They were a bit nervous. And they became still more nervous over the following days, because now these two queens, Jane and Mary, these rival queens, began to raise rival armies. Mary attracted an enormous amount of popular support. Ordinary people were flocking to her cause. And elite members of Jane's support discovered sometimes that their own tenants were refusing to fight under them against Mary. So there were a few more people getting jitters. And Mary now moved to exploit this further. And she did this by deciding that everything was going to be blamed on this man, the Duke of Northumberland, who was Jane's father-in-law. Now, Jane, who here is bearing a remarkable resemblance to the actress Helena Bonham Carter, which is fine, by the way, because there are no contemporary images of Jane. There are later stories that she looked remarkably like the picture, the Delaroche picture we saw earlier, but in fact, we don't know what she looked like, so she may well have looked like Helena Bonham Carter. But anyway, earlier that summer, in May, Jane had been married off to Guildford Dudley, the eldest non-unmarried son of the Duke of Northumberland. I think he was his third son. Now, there were two real reasons for this. One was that the people who wanted Jane to become queen, and there were a number of them, including, of course, Edward himself, they needed to have the Duke of Northumberland, who was the Lord President of Edward's Privy Council, extremely powerful politician and soldier, on side. Marrying his son to Jane was obviously going to help with that. The other reason was that Edward and other Protestants did not believe that female rule was a positive thing in any way. Indeed, they believed there were biblical injunctions against it. And one of Edward's own royal chaplains said that to accept female rule was to be an enemy of God. This being the case, Edward was keen for Jane to be married off as soon as possible in the hopes that she might produce a son. It was also highly likely that Guildford would be named king in the parliament that was due to be called in September. So that was why Jane was married. But ordinary people were aghast at the idea of having this strange boy, Guildford Dudley, as King of England. Who was he? He wasn't royal. It seemed to them most extraordinary, and they were very suspicious of what lay behind it. And Mary cleverly issued a proclamation on July the 18th, in which she blamed everything that was happening, the whole crisis, on Northumberland. And she said that it was all about his ambition to make Guildford King of England by means of a newfound lady's title. She didn't even mention Jane. Now, the reason she did this was twofold. One, she wanted to signal to the elite, because she still needed the elite, she needed people from the elite on her side, that she was still prepared to pardon them if they came to their senses and supported her now. And she was indicating, I have a scapegoat in mind, and that scapegoat is going to be Northumberland. He's going to be blamed for everything. She didn't name Jane because she didn't want to draw attention to the fact that Edward had in fact bequeathed the throne to Jane. She just wanted that sort of not looked at too closely. Anyway, her actions were very successful, and the next day, leading members of the Privy Council sneaked out of the tower where Jane was reigning and declared Mary Queen in London. Poor Jane found herself now locked up in the tower from where she had reigned for 9 days since she had been proclaimed publicly in London, 13 days since Edward VI had died. Mary was now as good as her word. She pardoned pretty much everyone. Northumberland was blamed for everything, had his head chopped off. Even Jane's father was pardoned. Jane and Guildford weren't immediately pardoned because, of course, Mary had to make everyone well aware of the fact that she was the rightful queen and not Jane. And one of the ways of doing this was by holding a treason trial. And Jane and Guildford were duly found guilty of treason at this trial, which was in November. Mary had, however, made it plain that she intended to pardon Jane. She wanted Jane to appear like Northumberland's innocent dupe, because that tied in with her suggestion as well that Edward, too, had been Northumberland's innocent dupe. And so stories were put out that she had never wanted to marry Guildford, that her father had beaten her to make her marry him, and that, in turn, her father had been manipulated by Northumberland. It was even said that she had never wanted to be queen, that she had always believed that Mary was the rightful queen. Unfortunately for everyone, all those who supported the idea of Jane's pardon, the real Jane and her real motives were now about to emerge. Because on the 15th of December, Mary Tudor re-legalised the Catholic Mass in England, which had been abolished by Edward VI. Now, Jane regarded the Mass as a form of satanic cannibalism, and she now wrote an open letter in which she condemned it in pretty violent terms, and in which she called on all good people to make a stand against it. Christ, she said, came to divide one from another, and that people should rise again in Christ's war. Her father, meanwhile, was also rather annoyed that Mary had announced that she intended to marry her cousin, Philip of Spain. He did not want to see a foreign king of England. And he was now plotting a revolt with a man called Thomas Wyatt, which went off early the following year. When it did, Thomas Wyatt's army came very close to overrunning London. But Mary, the populist, now emerges, because she gave a very remarkable speech at the Guildhall in London, in which she told her audience that when she had been crowned, she had been married to her kingdom, and that her coronation ring was to her a wedding ring, and that her subjects were to her her children, and she loved her subjects as a mother would her children. And the speech was very successful, and the revolt was soon crushed. Jane's father was amongst those who were to be executed as the ruthless Mary now emerges. Ruthless enough to order even the execution of her 16-year-old cousin. Jane, however, was still not going to be a mere victim. This young girl went down fighting, and how. She produced a series of writings in the days and hours before her death. And these writings were to become the basis of the most powerful anti-Marian propaganda of the reign. So one of these pieces of writing was a letter to her 13-year-old sister, Lady Catherine Grey. And again, this was really a letter aimed at a wide public audience, and it would be published to that effect. And in it, she tells Catherine that she is dying a martyr, and that everyone must, oppose the reintroduction of Catholicism and the Mass in England, and that they too, if necessary, and Catherine specifically, should also be prepared to die as martyrs. On the scaffold itself, Jane gives a speech in which she says that she is indeed guilty in law of treason, but, she says, she is innocent of the sin of ambition. She never sought the crown, in other words. She's reminding people that Edward VI had left her the crown. This, of course, is not something Mary wants people reminded of. Jane dies very bravely. And, of course, her writings and the manner of her death are all very useful sticks for Mary's enemies to beat her with. And this really puts the younger Grey girls in a rather dangerous situation if Mary, the Queen, perceives them as a threat. And so their mother, Frances, does what she can to lower the political temperature. Her husband's been executed, and so what she now does is she remarries immediately to a member of her household, an educated Protestant, a very educated Protestant called Adrian Stokes. He's a respectable man, but he's not royal, and he's not even noble. There's no way this man would ever be accepted as a king of England. And so what she's saying to Mary, what she's signaling to Mary is, I'm out of this Game of Thrones. My daughters and I, we're out of the game. You needn't worry about us. Mary responds generously, and she even invites the Greys back to court. And Lady Catherine Grey is given a senior position in her household. And so things begin to look a bit better for the Greys. But in 1558, Mary Tudor dies, and Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors, becomes queen. Frances, the mother of the younger Grey girls, dies herself in 1559. So these young girls are on their own in the world, really. Catherine, I think, turns 18 in the year that Elizabeth becomes queen. And their lives really do change quite quickly because Elizabeth makes it plain that she hates and fears these Grey girls. Why? Because she feels that they are her potential replacement. They are her heirs in English law, the same law under which she has been able to inherit the throne, although illegitimate. And although they are Protestants like her, Elizabeth greatly fears many of her own Protestant supporters. She realizes that they may decide to push her aside for two reasons. One, if she doesn't prove Protestant enough. Now, Elizabeth's Protestantism is what we might think of as sort of high church. It wasn't dissimilar to that of Charles I in the 17th century. And look what that got him. We were talking about William Byrd earlier. Well, strict Protestants at this time did not approve of music. During the reign of Edward VI, organs had been destroyed all over England and ripped out. Elizabeth loved music in her royal chapels, and William Byrd indeed was a Catholic. So Elizabeth's Protestantism was viewed with some suspicion. But there was something else. Of course, Elizabeth famously never married. She was the Virgin Queen. And as we know, Protestants didn't really approve of female rule. They were desperate for her to marry, desperate for her to produce a son. What if instead one of her heirs, one of these Grey girls, married and produced a son? Elizabeth was terrified that would happen and was determined that they would never marry. But they did. Lady Catherine Grey married an entirely suitable king consort, a man called Ned Seymour, Earl of Hertford, the son of the Protector Somerset, who had introduced Protestantism to England. Elizabeth threw her into the Tower, and Ned also, but Catherine nevertheless produced 2 sons in the Tower. The second one, almost unbelievably, after the warders, sympathetic warders, had left open the doors to her rooms and the doors to her husband's rooms, and a certain amount of corridor creeping had gone on in the Tower. You can imagine how pleased Elizabeth was about that. The younger sister, Lady Mary Grey, also married in secret, but she hoped Elizabeth wouldn't be too angry with her because she had married a commoner, a man called Thomas Keyes, who was a sergeant porter in charge of palace security. The marriage was considered a joke at court, monstrous, because Mary was tiny. She was the smallest person at court. I think she had scoliosis, like Richard III. Of course, she was part Plantagenet. Thomas Keyes, on the other hand, was enormous. He was huge. He was, after all, the tough guy in charge of palace security. So they were the kind of little and large. Elizabeth, however, wasn't at all amused, and she didn't care in the slightest that Mr. Keyes could never possibly have been king or pose any threat to her. And he was put into the Fleet prison, and Lady Mary Grey was imprisoned in a number of country houses, including Chequers. And she was only let out when Thomas Keyes had died. And you can see how angry she is here. She's showing us her ring, her wedding ring. She seems to be saying, at least I'm not a virgin. Poor old Catherine, on the other hand, was kept separate not only from her husband, but also from her elder son. And she fell into despair and died really of a broken heart when she was only 28 years old. She left her husband a final ring engraved with the pathetic words, "While I lived, yours." Elizabeth had had the little boys, Catherine's 2 sons, declared illegitimate. And so when she died in 1603, it was to be the Stuarts who inherited the English throne in the form of James I, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And so the last Tudor took to her grave, really, the story of this lost English Seymour dynasty, because nobody wanted to remember it. The Stuarts didn't want it remembered that there had been an alternative dynasty to them. the myths surrounding Lady Jane Grey only grew. In the 1560s, when Catherine still posed a great threat to Elizabeth, Catherine's supporters had been desperate to press Elizabeth to officially name Catherine her heir. And to encourage Elizabeth, they had wanted to inflate further the story of Jane's innocence, her innocence of ambition. They couldn't really continue to attack Northumberland in the way that they had attacked him in the past, because Elizabeth I was in love with another of Northumberland's sons, Robert Dudley. And so they began to sort of attack the dead parents, Jane's parents, her father, but also to a lesser extent her mother. And there was a story that her mother and father used to sort of pinch her and sort of shout at her when she was not doing well enough at her lessons. However, in the late 17th century, this myth became hugely inflated. A play was written by a man called John Banks called Innocent Usurper. And there are novels out there now with titles like Innocent Traitor, which built on this tradition. And in which Frances, the mother of the Grey girls, becomes a kind of wicked queen to Jane's Snow White. Even more influential was when this painting of Lady Dacre and her son was relabeled in the early 18th century. And it was relabeled as being of Frances and Adrian Stokes. Now, Lady Dacre may have liked her pies, but I don't think that makes her a bad person. But to others, apparently it does. And they said she was not only greedy for the pies, but Frances was also greedy for power and riches. And something even worse than that, she also obviously liked sex. And so they have her here depicted with her supposed sort of toy boy husband. She is a sort of cross between Madame Macron and sort of Cruella de Vil. And this, believe it or not, was exactly how poor old Frances was perceived and condemned until I did my work on the Grey sisters. This is the real Frances. This is her effigy at Westminster Abbey. And as you can see, she doesn't look very much like poor old Lady Dacre. Another things I discovered, actually, I found this lost manuscript which revealed that Lady Mary Grey, the youngest of the Grey sisters, is buried with her mother at the Abbey. No one knew where she was buried before. And also which describes the funeral, which is rather moving because it was attended by lots of people who had been very significant in the lives of both Jane and Catherine Grey. I'll end, though, with this tomb, the only tomb to one of the Grey sisters on their own, which is Lady Catherine Grey. Ned Seymour, her husband, she died aged 28. He lived to be 83. 83. He lived right until late in the reign of James I. And when he died, their grandson had Catherine disinterred from her obscure burial place in Suffolk and brought down to Salisbury Cathedral, where he'd built this magnificent tomb for his grandparents. And it celebrates the lovers who had been separated by Elizabeth being reunited at last. I wonder, however, how many people who visit this amazing tomb at Salisbury Cathedral have any idea who Lady Catherine Grey was, that she was the sister of the 9 Days Queen, that she was the mother of this Seymour dynasty, this lost English dynasty that never was. And so that is, I think, where we'll leave it today, except I'm going to go back to a picture of Mary I that I know Nicholas wants to talk about. To admire this magnificent pearl you wanted to ask me about, didn't you?
Well, I just wanted to spend just a second on this rather tough-looking portrait by Philip II of Spain's court painter, Anthony Moore. Round her neck is part of the Spanish crown jewels, a huge blue diamond bought by Philip II in Antwerp, which of course belonged to him here and a lot of Europe. Pretty much everything that didn't belong to France, actually. And below that, the world's most celebrated pearl called La Peregrina. This was stolen by Napoleon's younger brother when he was King of Spain, and he fled after the Battle of Vittoria. He, in exile in England, sold it to the Duke of Abercorn, and it was bought by Richard Burton and given to Elizabeth Taylor, and was sold at Christie's a few years ago for $11 million. So this is a famous pearl. This is the first portrait of a Spanish queen, in inverted commas, wearing the pearl. There were two further portraits of Spanish queens wearing just this kit, the diamond and the pearl. So these were perhaps the grandest jewels in royal ownership in Europe at the time.
She looks rather smart in it, doesn't she?
She looks very smart. The Spaniards did buy a second blue diamond. Philip IV bought a blue diamond, which passed through the Austrian Habsburg family to the Wittelsbachs in Munich, and the Wittelsbach Foundation sold that a few years ago. It was bought by Lawrence Graf, who scandalized everybody by recutting it slightly, but it did improve the color. It became a better grade. It was fancy blue, not just blue. So
the Tudors loved their pearls.
yeah, yes, pearls were absolutely.
Walter Raleigh even had pearl-covered shoes, which must have been quite extraordinary, walking along in your pearl-covered shoes.